Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the panel discussion for tonight on education in Cuba and the diaspora, a teacher-oriented conversation. My name is Jorge Duani. I'm the director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University here in Miami, which organized tonight's event. I'm also happy to acknowledge the co-sponsorship of the event by FIU's Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center, and as well as the Title VI grant from the Department of Education to LAC. As usual, I want to thank my colleagues, Aime Correa, our public affairs manager at the Cuban Research Institute, and Ashley Nunez, who is a work study and is soon to graduate, so congratulations. And in addition, Jocelyn Martinez from Information Technology at FIU is helping us to manage this event. I want to explain briefly the background of this event. First of all, as many of you know, the Cuban Revolution of 1959, as well as the ongoing diaspora it has produced, especially here to Miami, are two of the most significant historical events in the Western Hemisphere. For social studies teachers in particular, between the grades kindergarten and 12, as well as universities, teaching about Cuba and the Cuban American community remains a pedagogical challenge amidst polarized views and personal experiences that connect students and family members to this topic. It is especially difficult to maintain a balanced perspective on the causes and effects of the Cuban Revolution, as well as its impact on the United States, and particularly here in South Florida. So the main goal of this panel discussion is to identify a few of the basic pedagogic issues involved in teaching about Cuba and the Cuban diaspora. The panel gathers 3 experienced educators to share their work on various topics related to the literacy campaign in Cuba in 1961, Cuban American teachers in Miami, as well as strategies to incorporate Cuban and Cuban American topics in everyday classes. I would estimate that at least 1/3 of the more than 347,000 students currently enrolled in Miami-Dade County are themselves, in the public schools I mean, are themselves of Cuban origin. And yet most of the existing curriculum and textbooks in the social sciences and the humanities make only passing references to major historical events involving Cuba and the United States, such as the Spanish-American War in 1889, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Cuban Missile Crisis, or the Maria Exodus. We're very proud of our collaboration with the Miami-Dade County Public Schools in the past few years, when we hosted several summer art institutes for teachers, promoting the incorporation of Cuban and Cuban American materials, including our own collections at FIU, in their teaching lessons. This summer, we look forward to collaborating with a series of summer institutes on Cuban and Cuban American studies, designed by the Department of Social Studies of the Miami-Dade County Public Schools, in collaboration with our partners at LAC, the Cuban Heritage Collection of the University of Miami Libraries, and other partners. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator, Dr. Sarah Matthews, who will serve as chair, as well as moderate the discussion with tonight's presenters. Dr. Matthews is associate professor and chair of the Department of Teaching and Learning at FIU, and she has taught social studies and education courses for many years, as well as having conducted fieldwork on education in several Latin American and Caribbean countries. So I now give you Dr. Sarah Matthews.
Thank you, Dr. Duani, and thank you all for attending our panel tonight. I have the privilege of introducing our esteemed panelists. So our first presenter today is Ulysses Mena, who is a local Miamian who migrated from Havana, Cuba, and a proud graduate of Florida International University, where she earned a bachelor's degree in history and postgraduate work in curriculum and instruction. She currently works at Gulliver Preparatory Academy and also adjuncts for our department in teaching and learning. Her research focuses on historical phenomena related to education and the use of oral histories. Her presentation tonight is titled "The Pedagogy of Youth Teachers of the Cuban Literacy Campaign." Our second presenter, Victor M. Barrios Jr., was born in Colombia and moved to Pennsylvania for his elementary school years. He then moved to Miami for high school and earned his PhD in curriculum instruction at Florida International University. He also holds a master's degree in social studies education and a bachelor's degree in history. He's taught world history, American history, economics, and government for many years in the Miami-Dade public school system at various schools. His area of specialty is cross-cultural analysis of Latinx teachers and their pedagogical beliefs, practices, and curricular decisions. His presentation today is titled "The Influence of Cuban American Social Studies Teachers, Cultural Consciousness in Miami, and Their Pedagogical Beliefs and Curricular Decisions." And then our final presenter today is Laura Mesa, who was born and raised in Argentina, where she got her university degree in geography from the University of Buenos Aires. She worked at the United Nations Development Program, assisting the project director in research and data analysis, and taught at the University of Buenos Aires and at many private schools. In 2002, she earned a master's degree in Latin American Studies at FIU. She currently teaches world history, advanced placement, human geography, and women's studies at Palmer Trinity School, where she has also taught Latin American history. She's the co-chair of the History and Humanities Department, and her presentation tonight is titled "The City of Miami as a Teaching Lab, Exploring Students' Experiences in Little Havana." Each panelist today will give a 15-minute presentation. After the three panelists have finished, I will facilitate a question and answer session. So feel free to enter any questions you may have into the question box at the bottom of your screen. I will be curating these questions throughout their presentation for that final Q&A session. And with that, I will now turn the space over to Dr. Mena.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm grateful to be here. Thank you, Dr. Matthews. And before I begin, this topic is very personal and dear to me because as someone that grew up in the Miami public school system, but was born in Havana, Cuba, I was one of those people that saw myself reflected differently sometimes than how the textbooks talked about my country of origin and how it affects our students. So tonight I'm beginning the process of the discussion talking about a really important educational movement in the island of Cuba called the Cuban Literacy Campaign of 1961, and how the people that participated at that time, I interviewed them years later, 60 years later, but living outside of Cuba in either the exile community or just referring to themselves as people living outside of Cuba. Asking questions about representation, the double face of Cuban history, or there's two sides to a story, and how that affects representation to our students that the other panelists will build on and discuss with you all tonight. So with that, I'm ready to begin my presentation for you all. The pedagogy of the youth teachers of the Cuban Literacy Campaign. The Cuban Literacy Campaign of 1961 was undeniably amongst the world's greatest educational accomplishments of the 20th century. Scholar Peter McLaren uttered these words claiming the domestic and transnational importance of the literacy campaign that took place in Cuba in 1961, which distinguished itself because of the use of adolescents as instructors to teach older illiterate populations on the island during the early years of the Cuban Revolution. McLaren's words echo the celebratory sentiment academics and the world newspapers have concerning the campaign. As I interviewed participants 60 years later, the narrative of what they did and what occurred becomes more complex as their contradictory feelings reveal a time of zeal and excitement that reflection and memories years later do not always resonate. Because Cuban history has multiple narrative perspectives, I tried to study the campaign in a way that shied away from politics, but that was not possible based on the participants' responses. After 1959, the new revolutionary leader, Fidel Castro, utilized education as his most valuable weapon in order to indoctrinate the Cuban people. The literacy campaign and all forms of daily life would have a revolutionary purpose for the citizens learning new ideological tenets. Che Guevara, Castro's top lieutenant, would be instrumental in the education process and creating a new Cuban citizen, beginning with the nation's youth. They began a literacy campaign which aimed to reduce illiteracy and to spread a new message to the Cuban people of a new consciousness to work for the collective. The campaign was successful as it produced a significant decline in illiteracy. Cuba's illiteracy rate dropped from 23% at the beginning of the year in 1961 to 3.9% by the time the campaign was completed in December 1961. Nonetheless, controversy surrounds these numbers, and attention to distinctions between the census data of illiteracy in the rural versus urban areas should be noted. According to scholar Shimoniak, propaganda was a major component of the campaign to re-educate the populace. The Cuban teacher was tasked with spreading a political message to the entire island, achieved by the closing of the schools for 8 months in 1961. Cuban teachers used the grammar book, Venceremos, to teach basic grammar to the illiterate population, as well as the teacher handbook called Alfabeticemos, let's alphabetize. Shimoniak describes the grammar book, Venceremos, we will triumph, created by the newly formed revolutionary government as a political textbook, which ties the campaign to the ideological shifts present in the post-revolutionary era. These political textbooks encompass various themes, which emphasize the struggle to create a new Cuba that would compete with the imperialistic America and create a more equitable society free of capitalism. Richard Fagan, one of the first American scholars to visit the island in the decade after the revolution, remarks how the literacy campaign's textbooks, whose instructional manual was named Alfabeticemos, was, quote, profoundly political in nature. This is just a sample of some of the instructions given to teachers, which is a letter to prove that you were literate, that you had to write Castro thanking him for the literacy campaign and the work that was done at that time in '61. Having adolescents involved in the Cuban literacy process as teachers, not students, was a feat of the campaign and distinguished it from the numerous worldwide literacy campaigns that came before it. Accommodations were quickly made to train the youth teachers and have them begin their new work for the revolution. Castro understood the urgency of spreading new educational material to re-educate the population and attempt to make literacy levels more egalitarian. As a result of Castro's urgency to go forth with the campaign, youth teachers were trained for short periods in Varadero Beach, a place formerly frequented by Cuban elites, or the Conrado Benitez Brigadists in particular, named after the young martyr killed while teaching, trained only for 7 days, then went off to teach the rural illiterate populations of Cuba. These young non-professional teachers received minimal training for a grand feat in education, requiring skills such as scaffolding, which means building upon other skills, or modeling, doing or mimicking what your teacher does, and had very little time to acquire these skills. The youth teachers implemented many pedagogical practices during the campaign, and pedagogical practices was one of the major themes found within the participants' responses in my study. The study found that pedagogy was also politicized. These teachers' practices included the use of basic teacher skills like scaffolding and the available technology of 1961 using simple chalkboards. Many teachers turned to alternative methods when they realized the ones they used were not effective. A major finding was that teachers used magazines and newspapers outside the government-issued books to teach despite being told not to do so. Luisa said, for example, quote, magazines and anything I could get my hands on, I used to teach my students. The other youth teachers in the study did the same, which highlights their original intent in joining the campaign, simply teaching their students. The teachers were interested in student learning above all else, which motivated them to stray outside the boundaries set by the revolutionary government. This direct insubordination further reveals the political nature of the campaign and the lack of teacher autonomy that could further be explored in another study. The participants cared more about teaching and learning. The methods used, including political content, was secondary. Here's a sample of some of the political themes that you would find in Venceremos, talking about cooperatives, agrarian cooperatives. And I'll get later into using print and conjugating words, verbs, etc. All participants explained that pedagogically, some level of autonomy was afforded to the youth teachers. Victoria explains, quote, "I did my lessons and prepared them myself. Maria said she would use booklets or cutouts to supplement lessons, and Luisa used elementary school books to teach basic phonetics. Although professional teachers as mentors oversaw them, they explained that they used modeling and created their own methods in order to teach their students. The literature never mentions youth teachers using other sources outside government-issued books like Venceremos. In the existing literature provided by the Cuban government, anything I've ever read, I've never had anyone read this or explain this. So I really focus on pedagogy, trying not to be so political in the study, but there is no way to remove politics from anything I believe that happened in Cuba, especially after 1959. This finding is significant in that it signals the youth's motivation, at least for the participants in my study, and it was less political than the government, and they were willing to use any method at their disposal to teach basic literacy to their fellow citizens. An example of this is Luisa's comment about her mentor teacher, Ofelia. Luisa states that she had an older student, so these are adolescents, teenagers teaching older people in the population, who was not a revolutionary. She tells her mentor teacher, Ofelia, "My student is not a revolutionary. What do I tell her about the content?" And Ofelia responds to the youth teacher, Luisa, "Look," quote, "look, you explain and you tell her that the only thing that interests you is that you teach her how to read and write." In a way, this was a form of subversion, stepping outside the government mandated book that the youth teachers thought necessary to reach their goal, literacy. This brings up many questions, including how politicized the lessons were and how students handled the content. Not all people that learned under the Cuban literacy campaign were revolutionaries. It also suggests that youth teachers cared about teaching more than being zealous followers of rules placed by the new revolutionary government, including which book to use. Luisa explains one of her lessons. Quote, "We easily taught them using non-cursive letters. In print, that's how they were taught, at least in the city. So during the campaign, when the schools were closed, brigades, Conrado Benito's brigades went out to the rural areas, but literacy did happen also in the urban areas." Luisa continues by saying, "But at least there they were taught with print. And to read, we would write the letters and we would make them read them along with us and the vowels and then joining together the syllables. For example, the word mother, ma, ma. Ma first, then the second ma." The youth teachers modeled after their professional teachers, first using basic skills learned, such as teaching the vowels and then scaffolding to conjugate them and build words. Luisa expressed this was an effective method she learned from her teachers. She said, "I basically did exactly what my teachers taught me." Scholar Richard Fagan, one of the first scholars to enter Cuba after the revolution and write about the new government, explains that the focus of Cuban society in 1961 was to use the literacy campaign for political transformation. Abel Prieto, in his 20-year commemoration article on the campaign, also admits that the campaign had a, quote, propagandist nature. Abel himself says, quote, "Some people may call this indoctrination, but we are proud to use it," end quote. MacDonald, along with Fagan, was one of the first people to be allowed in Cuba to write about the campaign and agrees there was indoctrination involved in the country's political and cultural transformation. Although the literature supports this claim, the participants themselves did not go as far as using the word indoctrination. Many of them explained that as adolescents, they could not grasp the political nature of what was going on. Instead, in speaking with me, they chose to say that it was a political campaign and the resources they used, such as books, were politically motivated. This could be due to the loaded nature of the word, and they chose their words carefully with me or when speaking with me. And many of them that consider themselves members of the exile community don't always feel comfortable using loaded words and even expressing that they were part of any type of revolutionary activity during this time. Identity was linked to the decision to participate in the campaign and how to teach. The findings show that the participants experienced the political fervor and the pressure of the time, yet they also deemed the campaign to be altruistic by helping fellow citizens learn basic literacy. As Maria explains, quote, if the school closes and the government wants you to enroll and your family is politically involved, then you have to go. Every aspect of volunteering and participating was determined by your political affiliation. She also reflects on the teaching material, quote, and all of this is constantly telling you what the revolution means and transforming the way you think. So I didn't think much about it at the time. It is later when you look at it again and you say, God, I taught everything related to the revolution, you know, end quote. The same sentiment is shared by Victoria, who explained that her motivations to join the campaign were related to her contributing to the political transformation of Cuba and agreeing with it in the early years. She said, I'm going to tell you the truth like everyone else. I understand that Fidel came to do a good deed in Cuba. I was young and that's what I could understand. But after years passed, I understood that none of that existed. Luisa, the participant who shared the most details about pedagogy, which means how you teach, explained how, quote, they had to or had to write a letter to Castro, and that was their assessment. To Fidel Castro, recruitment, motivation, and pedagogy were all linked to politics. Identity continues to play a role in the motivations of the campaign and the perceptions that linger 60 years later. All three participants share that as children, a parent encouraged them to sign up for the literacy campaign. Not doing so was considered a disappointment. Participants described the social milieu of the time as, quote, euphoric. Cubans who believed in societal reform and who were fervently willing to adopt new cultural norms supported the campaign and believed a new revolutionary government could achieve a more egalitarian society. All three participants explained that during the initial stages of the revolution and the years of the campaign, they believed in Castro's ideas and sought positive change for the island. After decades of personal and economic hardships, all three of my participants realized that many of their ideological beliefs during their teenage years were vastly different from their experiences and thoughts as adults. The study found that those who took part in the Cuban literacy campaign had multiple motivations for joining the campaign. This would include curiosity for teaching, as well as outside influences that determine their decisions for recruitment and participation. During the study, themes like identity were present in the participants' responses, which explained their complicated experience in grappling with the changes in Cuba after 1959. Am I a revolutionary? Am I not? Can I talk about it in the exile community, what I did and what my political views were in 1961 as a young adolescent? Pedagogically, the study found strategies that teachers use, such as basic modeling, as well as using teaching tools outside of those provided by the Cuban regime. This data helps us understand how young students can take the roles of teachers and help peers or those much older than them to reach basic literacy skills. And it also asks us to question what it means to be a Cuban in exile or living outside of Cuba. And if you can express your participation in revolutionary activity 60 years later. And that will conclude my presentation. Thank you so much for your time.
Excellent. Thank you, Ulysses, for that engaging presentation. Our next presenter is, I'm going to turn this over to Victor Barrios.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to thank Dr. Duani and Dr. Matthews and everybody in the panel for having me here. My interests are on Cuban Americans and social studies teachers in Miami. And what I did was, this study is part of a broader, larger study for my dissertation. So in 15 minutes, I basically cannot go through every single point. However, I have tried to summarize it as best as I could, and I'll accept any questions after it's done. I'm having a little problem here. Okay, I begin with the question of what differences, if any, existed between Cuban American social studies teachers in Miami and other Latinx teachers concerning teaching practices and curricular decisions. Studies have found that teachers who shared a similar culture, race, language were better able to communicate, understand, and affirm students' culture. That's because they used their own cultural knowledge, added personal experiences with diversity, and utilized different learning opportunities, approach to curriculum from multiple perspectives. But Harris noted that teachers based their pedagogy and curriculum on their personal beliefs. Understanding and being aware of one's beliefs, bias, and prejudices influence teachers' ideology and pedagogy. This is the essence of cultural consciousness, and it is also part of my study. It is for teachers to self-reflect on their biases, their beliefs, their prejudices, and awareness of their own racial, ethnic, and linguistic beliefs, biases, and prejudices. Gay stated that to understand teachers' cultural consciousness, an in-depth examination of their ethnic and cultural identity is first needed. So the study that I used was cultural and qualitative research design. It was 3 to 4 semi-structured interviews for each participant. I created individual narratives, conducted cross-case analysis, and analyzed it through critical Latino theory because I focused on one Latinx group. So my research questions stem from the focus of the study. First, I'm going to describe what the teachers said about their ethnic and cultural identity. Then I'm going to see if I'm going to show personal experiences with discrimination and how they approach the official curriculum. Finally, pedagogical beliefs on teaching similar and diverse students. My participants were 5 self-identified Cuban American social studies teachers. Their ages varied from the early 20s to 50 years old. They had all lived in predominantly Cuban American areas within the city of Miami. It is the city with the largest concentration of Cuban-born and Cuban descent in the United States. There were 3 males and 2 females. 4 teachers are categorized as pre-Mariel immigrants because they either immigrated to the U.S. before 1980 or their parents did before 1980. All the teachers that taught or were teaching social studies and American history in the Miami-Dade public school system at the time of this study. The students were predominantly Latinx or Hispanic. So the first thing I'm going to do is go over summarize what these teachers said about their cultural identity. And then I'm going to discuss, in my own words, what I found from it, my discovery. One teacher said, I have Cuban ancestry with Cuban cultural influences. Another teacher said, I am Hispanic, but more Cuban. Third teacher said, I'm Cuban American, absolutely, but mostly Cuban. The fourth one said, I feel more Cuban. People say you look more Cuban. And the last one said, I consider myself completely Cuban American because I was born in Cuba and raised here. Most of the teachers said they did not experience much discrimination within Miami. I asked them why. One of them said, I don't know. I don't know if it was because I was the majority. The other one said, I'm Hispanic and I can relate. The third one said, in Miami, we Cubans have been able to keep everything Cuban. The fourth one said, I live in an Hispanic bubble. However, outside of Miami, the teachers saw themselves different from mainstream culture. For example, one teacher went to Michigan, said it felt like a different country. Another one who went to Georgia said he didn't try to speak Spanish out of respect. 2 of them said they were considered Mexican. So what I found with cultural identity was that these teachers had a strong affiliation to Cuban American cultural identity. They understood that they belonged to the majority culture in Miami. They also selectively acculturated a bicultural identity with both Cuban and American characteristics. And this helps to safeguard against discrimination, assimilation, full assimilation, right? Some characteristics that helped them were they knew full English and Spanish, and they developed a certain sense of self-confidence. However, they developed an understanding that they were viewed differently, culturally differently, in relative to mainstream American culture. Now, the next question, research question I asked was, how they made their curricular decisions. This was basically asking them how they approach the official curriculum. And the official curriculum are the state standards and American historical narrative used by social studies teachers as a guide for ideology, pedagogy, curricular decisions. This has been found to be representative of a dominant white male middle-class mainstream because it excludes, misrepresents, and stereotypes marginalized groups. Barbara Cruz's study of the Spanish-American War in Florida history textbook found that there was little mention of Cuban participation in the war, no mention of Cuban heroes, no discussion of American imperialism, and they portrayed the U.S. as solely responsible for winning the war. In the research and studies, Latinx teachers tended to challenge or oppose this official curriculum and the American historical narrative found in American history textbook. Some of the strategies they used were counter stories. They used their own personal experiences with discrimination and added multiple perspectives to the information found in the textbooks. Like teachers in the study, first of all, accepted the state standards without much challenge to it. One of them said, I use the standards because we are assessed by them. Another one said, you have to follow them. Third one says that they're okay. Fourth one said that they're used there as a guide. And the last one said, I follow the state standards so I won't get fired. Also, when it comes to the information inside the textbooks or the American historical narrative, most of them were hesitant to challenge. Although in this question, I did find some, I keep changing the words, hesitant, a sort of a belief that the information, it wasn't exactly what it seemed. I'll quickly go over some of the responses. I didn't find any information that was wrong. I picked and choose what that was more valuable. I found information that was questionable because it was politically skewed. Another one said, I followed the history textbook and didn't challenge it and only taught about the information that I knew about. I didn't find information that was completely wrong. I found information I don't agree or understand. Now, there was one teacher that seemed to understand about challenging the textbook. He said that there was no alternative facts. The textbook is not always right. Like he challenged it or he ignored some of the information. Castro died during this study. So it was a great opportunity for me to ask the teachers if they taught about Castro, the seminal Cuban event. Especially, I grew up thinking that when he died, this city was gonna rise up and have a big party. So first teacher said, Castro died, never came up in my class, and my students didn't seem to care. Another one said, I taught about him as a human being, but then said, let's go on. Another teacher said, I just went over it in class. I knew him dying wasn't going to change anything. Fourth teacher said, I don't talk about Cuba because it's not in the textbook. One teacher did make a lesson of it. And she said that, yeah, I got emotional, showed videos of me celebrating in Calle. So why were these teachers hesitant to challenge the official curriculum? Well, number one, it was a requirement by the state and district. It was also used as a guide for teaching, sort of helped them in teaching and instructing. It was part of assessment. Also, teachers lacked sufficient knowledge of the subject. They only added information when they found it agreeable. And there was an absence of Cuban history in the textbooks. I also came up with one that it's sort of my informant, that there was an implicit belief that challenging the American historical narrative meant challenging the United States itself, and that they were hesitant to do that. So how do you challenge the official curriculum? Well, you incorporate Cuban-American narratives, you add teachers' personal successes and experiences. You also critically analyze the portrayals, misrepresentations, and omissions of Cuban-American historical narrative. Some of the examples of these are fleeing communism, fighting against local discrimination, living in a foreign land, providing Cuban-American political, cultural, and economic immigrant success stories, and adding Cuban-American entrepreneur stories, members in Congress, and so forth. My last question that I asked them was the pedagogical beliefs in instructing students of similar and diverse backgrounds. Quite a few of them said that Spanish did help them when they were teaching students that were similar, because it helped them make connections. But when it came to diverse students, one said, you must know the population. One teacher said, I use the same information, but in a different way. One said that it was tough and challenging, that he only was able to click with students who knew English. Teaching all students the same was the answer to one of the teachers, but he said that you must tailor the curriculum to fit diversity. One teacher used own experience to teach culturally similar students, but found it a culture shock when it was teaching culturally diverse students. So what I found was, like I said, speaking the same language helped these teachers to make connections, connect and make connections with their culturally similar students. All had some degree of issues in structuring culturally diverse students. They did not know the lives of the culture of the students, as one teacher said. And like Geneva Gates said, they were living in separate worlds from their students. Some teachers did advocate for the same education with all the students, not accounting for cultural diversity or different learning outcomes. So, in conclusion of this, I found that the Latinx social studies teachers in this study needed to understand the importance of cultural consciousness. This is because by examining their beliefs, their prejudices, and their practice, they were better able to teach in a culturally inclusive fashion. Because first of all, they're reminded of their ethnic and cultural histories. They also comprehended that not all students learn in the same fashion, and they come to know the culture of their diverse students and make connections with them. Okay. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Victor, for your presentation. And now I'm going to introduce our final presentation, Laura Mesa.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm going to share my screen. So my work is based on teaching a course in Latin American history here in Miami and using the city of Miami as a laboratory to experience that learning process. I teach a group of diverse students in my school. So my goals were, how could I integrate global competencies in this diverse setting? How can I help my students explore their own identities through narrative? To do so, I used ethnographic methods to make a bridge, to build a bridge between students' narratives and the history of Latin America, and also using the city of Miami as a laboratory for the history that happened on this other side. So this is the model, the framework that I use, the global competence, which is defined as the capacity that students have to understand and appreciate perspectives different from theirs, right? Engage in open and fruitful conversations, interacting with people from other cultures, examine, of course, their own global and intercultural issues, and then the latest stage is to take action for collective well-being. And everything is weaved through 3 dimensions: the knowledge that you gain during the course, the skills that you are going to develop, and then the attitudes and the values that students are going to gain. That is the long term. So to represent this dynamic, this is a graphic of concentric circles that invites students to start with their own narratives and knowing themselves, being aware of their own multiple identities, so they can move away and take risks and start perceiving others in their own diversities. And by this progression, they may gain this intercultural capacity to interact with others. So I use the work of Ruth Becher, who is a cultural anthropologist specialized in Cuba, who emphasized the importance of writing and the use of narrative, because that opens possibilities for you to discover not only you, but also to discover the others, right, in ethnographic writing. So I designed my course using this analogy, the DNA double helix, because I wanted to integrate 2 dimensions here. One is the personal history and the personal identities. And the other one is the collective history of Latin America and the multiple identities. So what I did here was to design a curriculum that integrated these 2 dimensions by asking students to explore their multiple personal identities and then write their family history and dig into their family heritage. And at the same time, we were going to introduce the study of the city's identity, and of course, the regional identities, the history of Latin America and its multiple heritages. I became also very aware of the importance of building this notion that culture is comfort, that you belong when you feel that you are part of. So I got inspired by the work of Dr. Sarah Mahler, who wrote this book, Culture as Comfort. And using this book helped me to dig activities to invite students to explore how they felt when they experienced cultural discomfort, when they felt that they were like fish out of the water, when they didn't fit in. And this was a long process. Of course, I'm summarizing, this was a year-long course. So they have to write, they have to start exploring. So I divided my work in 5 stages. I started with a survey, which is the first stage. Then I moved into the genealogy that each student had to bring. Then students explored their multiple personal identities. Then we took a participant observation trip to Little Havana, and then they wrote the family history and heritage. Everything combined while we were juxtaposing the history of Latin America. Of course, I did both. So in the first stage, I gave students a survey. They had to respond the place of birth for themselves, from their parents, grandparents, and then questions about identifications. How do you self-identify? How do you define your ethnic identity? Does your family heritage or ethnicity define your personal identity? And if so, why is it important to you? And if not, why? So after the survey, I came up with this result. 38% of my students were born in Iberoamerica and 62% were born in the US. With Cuban heritage, I had 71% of the students class and 29% had no connection with Cuba. The second stage was to ask students to explore their genealogy. So they had to find out their roots, and some students could trace back as far as the student could. And not everybody was able, but they did it. Then in class, they had to bring 3 items that they chose as their own identifiers. And they had to tell us why they chose it and why did they, that item was so significant. And then we mapped all the movements of migration that my entire class had. The third stage was to help students dig into their cultural identities. So I work with 10 dimensions that I listed here, right? These are microcultures of identity, so class, race, ethnicity, gender, language, religion, exceptionality, which means if they have any exceptional ability that differentiates them from others, age, geographies, places where they interact and belong, and even politics. That's a category that I added later because some students identified or found this category as the first identifier. And I use many videos, but this one is in particular very interesting because from the Pew Research Institute or Center, in which we know that almost 77% of Americans are describing themselves as multiracial, and 28% multiracial adults have changed the way they describe their own racial identity. And as we know, identity is very complex and is also dynamic. So when the students wrote about their multiple identities, they did it in a way that they prioritized those categories that were very strong identifiers. This was one of my students who I interviewed, and she told me that she identifies herself as Cuban American, but she experiences a barrier language when she has to communicate with her grandparents because she doesn't speak Spanish very fluently. And she pretends that she understands, but she really suffers because of that barrier. And she wanted to take the course because she feels that Miami has a great connection with Latin America, and she wants to know more about the cultural background of her family and her identity. So I also invited very important scholars, Dr. Duani here, Dr. Gamarra here to my class, so they can bring their perspectives to the scholastic study. And then I designed the 4th stage of my work, which was to conduct a fieldwork trip. We visited La Ermita de la Caridad, which is this emblematic religious shrine in Miami, built by the exile community. We visited also Little Havana Calle Ocho. Students, of course, I taught them how to develop these tools, these skills, right? Ethnography. And they used participant observation, they conducted interviews, they took photographs, they also measured the density of the traffic, the interactions, the uses of the land. And we concluded with a visit to Fusion TV studios, and we interviewed journalist Jorge Ramos, who is a specialties in Latin American politics. So obviously I gave this stage of the work a very serious framework. So I prepared my students, they were professionally ready there. We previously read some passages from the book from Ruth Bejar Puentes, Cuba, and our Lady of Exile, and Richard Blanco. So those were, those were the preparations that I had. And then of course we visited La Ermita de la Caridad. We analyzed the murals, the historical figures. My students conducted interviews with visitors there inside the church, employees at the Ermita. They were taking notes, taking pictures, of course, with their consent, and basically surveyed the richness of this place as an element of Cuban identity. Then we moved to Little Havana, and they visited the iconic elements of the history of Cuba, like the Bay of Pigs invasion memorial to the martyrs. They also witnessed people playing domino. They also, I divided them in groups. So they interviewed locals, Cubans who visit Little Havana almost every day because they felt that they had that need to be reconnected. So you can see here my students interviewing different visitors there, and of course, iconic images of this neighborhood. And then we finished with the visit to Fusion Studios, and we interviewed Jorge Ramos, who was very grateful to have us there and share with us also his experience interviewing Fidel Castro. And then when we came back to the classroom, the students debriefed the fieldwork trip, they prepared their group presentations, and then they mapped. Each group was given a block, so they had to identify the different uses of the land and the results of their interviews. And moving to the final stage, the family history and heritage, I trained my students to conduct interviews with their parents and grandparents. So they had to write the narrative of their families. One of my students had her grandfather sharing school Belén with Fidel Castro. So she wanted to do this because her grandfather was very old and she wanted really to gain that aspect of her family. I also connected this study with the history of human rights in Latin America and the disappeared. I come from a country, Argentina, where we had thousands of disappeared people, but it's not only Argentina, we have Guatemala, Chile, many other countries. So this idea of identity and how important identity is to understand history was also emphasized in my class. And then I applied forensic anthropology with hands-on activities where students have to analyze bones and identify gender and age as forensic anthropologists do. So basically, to close this, I tried to weave into this DNA double strand, the personal narrative with the history of Latin America. Of course, I covered more than what I am presented. I also, in the second semester, took my students to Little Haiti, and we did the same. But we basically covered an entire curriculum for 1 year. So this is how we did it. By self-awareness, we developed that with all the stages of survey, genealogy, personal narratives, and family heritage. That enabled them to be connected to the others through urban ethnography. The macrocosmos vision came with the loss of human rights and identity and migration. And finally, the intercultural capabilities came, well, this idea of global citizen that we are able to develop beyond what we see. And that's it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. At this point, we're going to start a question and answer session. So I want to encourage you all to continue asking any question, writing any questions in that box at the bottom of the screen that says question and answer, and I'll be facilitating those questions. As we're waiting, there is a few, and then I'll be watching to see the ones come in. So as we're waiting to kind of organize those questions, I'm going to start off this discussion by asking all three panelists one question, and I don't care who, whoever wants to take it first, that's fine. The question I had is, based on your experiences and your research, what is one recommendation that you would give to teachers regarding their practice teaching about Cuba, sorry.
Well, concerning my research, I would say don't be afraid to teach it. But what I found is that there's a sort of a hesitancy towards teaching the subject. But for instance, when I was a teacher, I started teaching about Marielle, and I found that the students had no idea what it was or what happened. Even though that seems, at least when I was here when it happened, it was one of the most seminal events of Miami history. And so we're living in Miami, there's majority Cuban American, and yet the students who were mostly Cuban origin had no idea what happened. And I believe like a lot of the teachers, when I went over and I asked them if they ever taught Cuban history, a lot of them decided, they would say that no, that we shouldn't do that. I mean, I heard one teacher tell me that. I had another one say that we should just follow the standards and so forth. So I think it's this fear of just going against the curriculum that it prevents some of these teachers from doing it, more so than what the knowledge is.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would add to what Victor said exactly the same, because I think that there is a hesitancy when we have to innovate and do something that is out of the ordinary, right? But I think that regardless of where you live, connecting with the local community, I think that is the first step to really make that learning meaningful. And being here in Miami, where we have Miami and many other places in the United States and in the world, you have at hand so many resources and living testimony of the recent history that it's very shameful not to use that. But of course, I know that this entails work, research, reading a lot, but the rewards are extraordinary. So yeah.
I guess my contribution to the conversation, and I know my topic was a little bit different, but very similar in certain ways. What I found from interviewing people 60 years later at a different stage in their lives is that people are complicated and they can have contradictory feelings, views. And from the theory I know of oral history methodology and incorporating oral history as a tool for counter narratives, it just allows a more complete story that someone won't feel omitted from the history or misrepresented. So I just think it's I would use tools that could, if just teach it, and if a student comes to you and tells you that they have a different perspective, listen and find ways to incorporate it. And I think there's a beauty to a counter narrative that it doesn't mean it's negative. It might just be complementary. And as a history teacher, the last thing I'll say is that I teach my students that facts are facts, but the facts all the time are interpreted differently by historians, and they battle it out in history books. And it's so interesting to sometimes integrate some subjectivity into things that we think are so concrete when it deals with people and experiences, maybe not the event, but the experience of it. And I think that's valuable.
And to sort of follow up on that, from your all three of you, from your perspective, what do non-educators need to know about the teaching of Cuba?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. So my original question was asking about how do we as teachers teach, right? So with the question, another question is, so many of the people that may be on this, listening to this presentation, they might not always be all be teachers. So what information do we need to tell non-educators about Cuba, or how Cuba is being taught or represented?
I'll start. I think Well, one of the things is I think with everyone, I want to go back to identity. I think for some people in their lives, certain things might be really important in their identity, which could be, it could be something about gender, sexual orientation, something about race, other components of ethnicity that are your place of origin, birth, language, religion. So for the Cuban community or the Cuban experience, ideas of democracy, communism, political asylum, it's a very heavily politicized topic and experience. So if you're not a teacher, when you're talking to a Cuban friend or somebody, having some cafecito or anything with them, just know, I mean, and not all Cubans, again, are a monolith, and not all Cubans and Cuban Americans are the same, but politics was discussed at the table for many families day in and day out. And it's something that's very, like for many people, that could be multiple topics. There's Cubans that deal with more than just the politics, right? And being Afro-Cuban. But just if you have someone in your life that you care about and talk to and they're Cuban, just politics is a really big part of that. And just ask, I guess just ask questions, and that it has been a history that just has been contradictory many times, right? In the way that people can see themselves in the story and how it's portrayed in other ways by media or other countries. So I would say just listen about the politics. Politics is just a very important, I think, concept with identity.
And I think it's really interesting, Lacey, that you're talking about how the politics is may be discussed a lot in the home. And then Victor's study is showing, that a lot of teachers are hesitant to get into that political aspect in the classroom, whether it's because it doesn't match the standards or because they may be afraid of parents, or, Victor, what were some other hesitancies there?
Yes, it's, I mean, looking at this, the politics of the family, of the Cuban family, may differ from each other, the way they explain about how Cuban history progressed, as opposed to the teacher. I mean, growing up in Miami, I've seen it many times where Cuban Americans argue vehemently about politics in Cuba, and politics in Miami, for that matter. So I could see a non-educator looking at a teacher saying, well, how are you going to teach about Castro? How are you going to teach about this event that happened? And when it comes to politics, even more, like in the case of American government, how are you going to teach about Cuban Americans voting process and so forth? So I could see that as an issue. And that's why I agree with you, Leslie, that multiple perspectives should be presented. And it shouldn't be argued against. In some of the private schools I attended in Hialeah, some of the teachers were, I mean, you said something completely against what they were thinking, and we were going to be yelled at. So that was back then. So that is an issue, and I keep pondering over it. But again, I mean, we're supposed to provide for multiple perspectives. At least that's what I believe so. And it should be allowed. And that's what I would say to the non-educators. The teacher would just explain to them what occurred, the process, and let's see it play out.
We do have,
Sorry,
no,
no, I was thinking that it's not only with the Cuban community, it's with other communities as well, right? So for a person who's not an educator to have this open attitude, this open-minded attitude that you want to learn, there you are getting only a perspective. But I think that is very valid when you when we do not circumscribe our studies to one narrative, one story. So we can have this big, and we can amplify the spectrum of opinions, and that's fine. Because when I took my students to Little Havana, they were having conversations with people who were more extreme than others. And that's when we came back to the classroom, we were sharing our experiences, right? So it was not only one perspective. It depended on who was the interviewee, when did the interviewee arrive to Miami, and under what circumstances, right? So to put things in context. So I also believe that it's part of our critical thinking skills that we as citizens should develop.
Great, thank you. We do have some questions for individual presentations, so I'm going to ask the first one. This goes to Lacey. What do you think were the social philosophical effects of Cuban students regarding that final proof that their education being used to thank Fidel?
I didn't receive, since I interviewed more the teachers, not the students, I don't have any formal data on that, but from many things I've read or even seen documentaries about Cuba, Catherine Murphy and her documentary teacher, which is Maestra, the name is Maestra, I believe it's 2012. I do know that, again, sometimes it's very polarized, right? Not everybody was a revolutionary that maybe was taught during the Cuban literacy campaign, but it could go either way. Somebody was like, wow, they had to make this so overt, so political. And someone else could say, and to this day still says, I thank the revolution for making me a human being that I learned how to read and write. And it's apart from, if there was propaganda, indoctrination, it doesn't matter to them. So very polarized views, which again, to me is the Cuban story and could be the story of so many places, right? Where especially the history of Latin America, that sometimes political instability in a way that could even be chronic is present.
And Yuli, there is also a question about that asking, were the youth teachers recruited both male and female or just female? And if they're just female, what were the youth males doing during the time that the schools were closed during the campaign?
So this was mass mobilization for the entire society. Actually, one of the participants, I was only able to find 3 women that were able to do in-depth interviews with me, but one of them, her brother was also part of the Conrado Benitez brigades that went to the rural areas. So it was both male and female that were part of this process.
Great, thank you. There's a question here for Victor. Do you feel that since some Cuban Americans believe they are viewed differently outside of South Florida, it results in many of them staying in Miami, leading to why it has one of the largest populations of Cubans or Cuban exiles or Cubans from the diaspora in the world because of the familiarity that they may feel here? And even though that's directed to Victor, of course, anybody else is welcome to answer that question as well.
So to understand the question, they're saying, the questionnaire is saying that because the familiarity of Miami Cubans,
yeah, basically, do you feel that since Cuban Americans believe they're viewed differently outside of South Florida, is that leading to why many stay in Cuba? I'm sorry, many stay in Miami. Yeah.
I mean, I use the word discrimination, but it really, none of them said they were discriminated, but they did have a strong identity to affiliation to Cuban American. In Miami, up to this point, it shows that it's extremely has very strong affiliation to Cuban Americans. So I could see a comfort level here as opposed to going somewhere else. But I don't think that's the reason they don't move anywhere else. Or like I say, that's what stops them from moving other places. I just feel it's more like a comfort level. Here they could speak Spanish and English, for example, like one teacher said, didn't want to speak Spanish in Georgia, or practice their cultural characteristics like foods and so forth. One teacher said it was in a different foreign country. What I didn't add was that it was, he had said the reason for that is because it didn't have anything Cuban in Michigan. So he said that this feels like a foreign country. So I don't believe it's why the reason they stay here, but there is a comfort level. that is noticeable.
Does anybody else want to add anything to that?
Yeah, it's also part of the process of migration that migrants tend to move toward places where they have connections. And that's why this idea of culture as comfort is crucial to make you feel that you belong, that you can transit, you can be transferred to another country, you can move into exile, or you have the possibility to restart your life in another place, but still keeping your traditions and feeling that knowing how to do things because you have a network that supports you and contains you. That is very important. For example, there were a couple of interviewees who said that they go to Little Havana almost every day, because even though they don't live in the proximity of the neighborhood, but they have this need to be reconnected, to have to bring back a piece of themselves there. So I think that probably that is, and of course the network that the Cuban community has developed here.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with Laura. I'm definitely not an expert in answering any question of this nature, but when you get into social science and chain migration and providing opportunities for work, provisions, language, right? Those structures are very important, and it also it's intergenerational. So you might have that first generation or not even first generation be in Miami in an enclave, and then the children feel like they can leave, right? Because they've maybe assimilated more. In Miami, I've always felt acculturated and that comfort level of taking the best of my culture and then from the host culture, the United States, which is very diverse as well. But I have had people talk about their experiences in New Jersey where there are other Cuban enclaves, and it just doesn't seem to be the same as Miami. Not to mention, of course, the weather.
Laura, in your response to that last question, you kind of hinted at or started to talk about something that I've received 2 questions pertaining to, and that is when you mentioned that maybe people are not, Cubans might not be living right in Little Havana anymore, but going back. So one of the questions that was raised, or well, it was raised by two viewers, is how did your students respond to the ethnic diversity of Little Havana? Particularly since many or most of the current residents are not Cuban, but Central Americans, Hondurans, Nicaraguans, or South Americans, especially Colombians.
Well, it's interesting because on the second trip, I took my students to Little Haiti. And before doing so, I took my students to Redland Market, which is near Homestead, right? And there is a microcosmos of Latin Americans and Central Americans there. So it was interesting because when we came back from the second trip and they could compare the differences between the Little Havana and yes, it's diverse, but still you could see there a lot of Cuban food and the domino, the game of dominoes. They have the iconography, the monuments. You have a lot of presence of Cuban, yes, a lot of tourists, of course, but also this understanding that it has transcended the initial stage of what Little Havana became, right? Because it's now, we saw tourists dropping off the buses, for example, and visiting. However, when we went to Little Haiti, which is now under climate gentrification, and it's another issue that is very interesting to study, because these people are going to be displaced. Some of them have been displaced. They could see, first of all, the deterioration of the neighborhood, which is not the case of Calle Ocho or Little Havana at all. My students were a little hesitant to walk. They were divided in groups and they had to move around. Of course, I was with them, but they were hesitant because the fear that, and they said that even though it's very cosmopolitan now and diverse, Little Havana, they felt comfortable. It's a culture that they know. The language also is more familiar. Whereas in Little Haiti, people speak Creole, and it's a different neighborhood, not supported with lots of resources. They interviewed local people, and they said that they didn't have the economic support as the Cubans had. So that network, that affluence of resources and the different status that these two diasporic communities receive are completely different. Even the fact that we visited a school for adults in Little Haiti, and they were learning how to, not only how to speak English, how to operate in this culture, how to eat with cluttery, things like that. That was a very different experience. And of course I compensated because I knew that it was going to, I didn't want to bring a negative stereotypical view. We visited a very acclaimed artist in Little Haiti, Eduardo Duval-Carrier. So that was another dimension of the culture of Little Haiti that is full of culture, is full of artistic talent. So it's also, they could see the difference.
Great, thank you. There's a few questions that I think could be directed to all three of you. So one question is, what was something that impacted your research or your experience that you would like others to continue on your path in Cuban history or Cuban teaching about Cuba?
Well, I was going to mention this earlier. One thing I found fascinating from my research was how, for example, my youngest teacher participant, she was in her 20s, early 20s, and her parents were born here. And she even mentioned that her Spanish was going, but she still was calling herself Cuban American and Cuba, you know, I'm Cuban and all, and, you know, her identity was, so that type of, because as far as I know from immigration and assimilation, normally certain ethnic groups tend to become more assimilated into American society. And it seems like this is like a perfect example of acculturation in the point, bicultural, in the point that they're, the Cubans here in Miami are grabbing the characteristics from mainstream American culture and keeping holding on to their own Cuban culture. Now, as far as research goes, is there any prediction that this is going to keep on with the influx of more Latin countries coming into Miami, or maybe moving out of the wealthier, the more affluent Cuban Americans, and not to mention younger immigrants from Cuba, as we speak about that? That to me, there was one study I saw that did touch on this. It was a school in Miami, and she was noticing that there's becoming what she called it a Hispanic Cuban cultural hybrid is forming in Miami with their own way of speaking and so forth. So that's sort of what I would be interested in reading about or even studying.
Thank you.
I wanted to comment on, I think the idea of Spanglish and like the synergy of all these, the fusion of all these different things and new things evolving, right? I think it ties into the idea of, for example, a younger Cuban American or a Cuban that I was raised in Miami, so I hyphenate and I do Cuban American in how I identify. For me, the idea of legacy and the generation, the grandparent generation, through oral history and archiving experiences, and how those people can change what they tell and that wisdom they give their grandchildren about what happened in 59 and 61 in Cuba, and that family conversation at the table. I think that's key. I think that's important, and I think it takes a community, not to say a village, but it takes a community from the teacher to the historian who's going to make sure they archive that so that the teachers can tap into the resources. And I found that idea of leaving that rich cultural heritage legacy in archive really important from the work that I've done. And it's kind of me bridging how I teach and how I do my academic work.
Yeah, and I want to say from another perspective, from a more global perspective, I think it's very valuable when you can help students navigate the different stages through which a person may experience when he or she comes here, right? This idea that we tend to be like secluded in our own identity and we define ourselves in one way. In fact, this is so dynamic. It changes all the time. Even students, I know that they change their perspectives through the course. It was a year-long course, but I think that it makes you, well, first of all, it helps students be empathetic to other migrants, to other stories, not only here in the United States, in the world. So instead of jumping into a preconceived idea, you invite them to really explore different aspects of our human experience. We live in a global village. This is what it is. And sometimes that fear for the other comes because from the fact that we don't know the other. And if we teach from the textbook, awesome, it's great, but it's only one dimension of a very complex situation. And I think that the school should bridge that approach to give students an experiential learning that will modify eventually attitudes. And that is a very long-term goal, but I think that it's achievable and we may not see the results, but eventually that person will grow and in his or her future interactions in the world, the approach, the way of handling situations, the perception will be more open-minded and not judgmental.
That kind of lends itself to the next question in that what recommendations do you all have on books or films that college students or even high school students could use to learn about Cuba? What would you recommend individuals reading or watching? Or also, I know that there's some great websites out there too. So if you have any of those resources, please let us know.
Well, didn't Dr. Rani mention that there's going to be in the high schools they're adding some sort of Cuban history to the curriculum? I know when I started teaching, they started something like that. I forgot who was the person in charge, but then they never got off the ground. And again, maybe now if there is some sort of separate curriculum for Cuban history, and maybe we could expand it to Haitian history and Jamaican and any other group that's moved into Miami, make it more like a localized history. Maybe that would help students adjust better in high school, as opposed to, I've been in a few schools where you can see the isolation. It's like Laura was saying, where some students who are not part of the majority culture in the school tend to be isolated because they feel left out. And maybe if there's an avenue for them to sort of explore their culture, that wouldn't be such an issue.
Yeah, and I would recommend Dr. Michael Bustamante. He led a teacher seminar during the summer, and he put out there lots of resources to incorporate Cuban studies, not necessarily and only from the historical perspective, but from the artistic perspective, the arts and culture, which is easier for students to connect than the history, factual history, or the regular history that they learn in traditional courses.
I want to piggyback on what Lara was saying, that I had the pleasure at the time to take Dr. Bustamante's course a while back, and I was actually gonna, recommend. I mean, he talks a lot about, especially what's really interesting is that he talks. There was films for everything. So if you wanted to watch a film about the rafter crisis in '94 versus Mariel versus the early years of the revolution. So if you want to show the students a movie like The Lost City from Andy Garcia, but that has a particular exile perspective, right? If you want to show something else that could show a different perspective and it's more academic, you would use another resource, or you could look at material culture and look at artifacts, look at other things and interpret them. So I don't know if I can say one particular thing. I mean, I think everything has, as a history teacher and as a historian, everything has a bias. If you know nothing about Cuba, I don't know if you'd want to watch the Cuba Libre story that I think Netflix still has it. That's chronological. And of course, read wonderful articles, you know, from Dr. Duani, Dr. Bustamante, some of the authorities we have on Cuban history at FIU and, you know, other institutions. I read a lot of, you know, Lillian Guerra. And, but yes, his workshop, I just wanted to agree with that. It was, for me, it was wonderful to be exposed to that material on multiple levels, academically and also as someone that teaches in the classroom as well.
Yeah, and I would say contact FIU and LAC and the Cuban Research Institute. They have lots of resources for teachers and for the general public as well.
But we have to be careful, because remember that book a few years back that Vamos a Cuba was in the school, and it caused an uproar. So we have to be careful what are we bringing into the classroom, especially when it comes to high school. Again, the political aspect of it is always evident, like Lacey was saying. And so I mean, if we're going to present one side, then we have to present another side. And here we go. Like that's why I believe sometimes it's better to begin by codifying what are we going to teach, even though I believe in multiple perspectives. I believe we share, but sometimes in a city that's so political like Miami is, and let's be fair, then there's going to be issues about whatever is being presented up there.
And I would also like to point out too that FIU, we also house the Digital Library of the Caribbean, which if it's under DLOC, if you just Google DLOC, DLOC, there's also very many primary source documents there. That's a project that is focused on digitizing resources from, of course, the Caribbean, but there are quite a few. I think there is a large collection of documents that are from Cuba or focused on Cuba too. So I'll just put that plug in there for my DLOC friends. Okay, well, I'm looking at the time and I want to be respectful of everyone. I know that our panelists have been talking for a while, and I think they've touched on a lot of the questions that we've asked that have been placed in the question and answer session. So I want to take this opportunity to say thank you to our panelists for their engaging presentations. There is a request here for your information so that maybe people could reach out to you about how to, you know, with questions about how to teach about Cuba. Do you all feel comfortable with that? Or I could also, you know, how should people reach out to you?
Yeah, I'm very comfortable. I can share my email.
Sure.
No problem with that.
Okay.
You can share my email.
I guess maybe if you are interested, you can email me and I can get you in touch with those people. How about that? In my email, you can find it at FIU in the directory, but it's, I'll spell it for you. It's SAMATHEW@fiu.edu. And I have access to everyone on this panel, so I can definitely put you in touch with them. And so I want to thank you to the panelists, and I want to thank everyone that came to attend our session today and supporting these initiatives from LAC and from the Cuban Research Institute. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.